Let me show you a game between Vladimir Kramnik and Levon Aronian, played in 2012. 2 moments in it where Kramnik simply hands over material, and a finish where black's pieces are all still on the board and none of them can do anything. It comes from the Zurich Chess Challenge, and on the board is one of the oldest openings there is, the Four Knights game. Let's begin. We open with e4, white claiming the center, and Aronian answers e5, staking the same claim. Knight to f3 leans on that pawn, knight to c6 quietly defends it, knight to c3 makes it the four knights, and knight to f6 completes the symmetry. Then d4 strikes at the center, pawn takes d4 accepts the offer, knight takes d4 restores order, and bishop to c5 aims straight at that knight. So white props the knight up with bishop to e3, and already the black bishop is asking questions. It steps back to b6, keeping the same long look at d4. Queen to d2 connects everything behind the bishop. Aronian castles kingside, tucking his king safely away. Kramnik castles queenside instead, kings on opposite wings. And rook to e8 leans on the pawn on e4. So white shores that pawn up with f3, and black hits it again with d5. Pawn takes d5 opens the center, and knight takes d5 recaptures onto a wonderful square, forking the knight on c3 and the bishop on e3, and that bishop has only the queen looking after it. Something here has to give. Kramnik's answer is bishop to g5, suddenly staring down the diagonal at the black queen. Aronian goes for the complications with knight takes c3, a slightly loose choice. His queen now forks the knight on d4 and the bishop on g5, and the rook on d1 is hanging as well, 3 targets at once. But it is white to move, and bishop takes d8 removes the queen first. Knight takes d1 collects the rook, so the material stays roughly level. Now, should white just go and pick up that knight in the corner? Kramnik instead plays bishop takes c7, handing back material for activity, and here it lets black off the hook. The bishop on b6 eyes c7 and the knight on d4 together. So what was the cleaner path? Let me show you. Bishop to h4, a quiet retreat that keeps the bishop alive, because the knight sitting on d1 has nowhere to run and can be scooped up at leisure. The point is, black grabs the knight on d4, and then king takes d1 tidies everything up, with white a pawn to the good and much the healthier position. But that is not what happened. Bishop takes c7 recaptures, and that bishop now looks all the way down to h2. Kramnik hits back with knight takes c6, offering a trade on the queen side. The trapped knight escapes with knight to e3, touching the bishop on f1. So bishop to b5 defends the knight and dares black to capture. Pawn takes c6 is the natural recapture, but it is slightly loose. It opens the diagonal running straight back towards black's own corner, and white gets to move first. Because bishop takes c6 lands with a fork on both black rooks, a8 and e8, and neither one has a defender. That is exactly the price of opening a line towards your own back rank. Aronian counters with knight to c4, poking at the queen on d2. Queen to d4 steps aside and attacks the knight in return. Bishop to e6 links the rooks so they guard each other. Still bishop takes a8 walks off with one of them. Now bishop to b6 is black's little trick. The queen on d4 is attacked, and wherever she goes she would like to keep watching that knight on c4 as well. Queen to d3 manages both, and points at h7 too. Rook takes a8 wins the bishop straight back, and rook to e1 puts the last piece on the open file, looking at the bishop on e6. Rook to d8 seizes the other file and challenges the queen, who at that same moment is the one attacking both the rook and the knight on c4. She cannot simply sit still. Queen to e4 solves it, hitting the knight on c4 and the bishop on e6 at once. Black grabs space with g5, loosening his own king's shelter. White replies c3, quietly stealing squares from that knight. Bishop to c5 keeps the bishop out and active. Rook to e2 adds weight to the queen's work on the e-file. Black plays h6 to hold the pawn on g5, and here g3 is a shade slow, pushing h4 straight away would have cracked that pawn chain open. Even so, the queen keeps both the knight on c4 and the bishop on e6 in her sights. Aronian looks for counterplay with a5, but it does nothing about his real problem. The rook belonged on d5, taking the sting out of that queen. Two black pieces are still hanging in the air. Kramnik pushes f4, opening lines towards the black king. The pawn runs onto a4, then f5 arrives, striking the bishop on e6. Bishop to d5 steps forward and attacks the queen, who has the rook behind her for support. Queen to d3 slides back, still hitting both the bishop and the knight. Bishop to b6 retreats, and this is where things really slip. Bishop to d6 would have kept the position knitted together. Now white gets to go after that knight on c4 with everything he has. That begins with b3 hitting the knight and the a4 pawn. Pawn takes b3 tries to clear the air, and pawn takes b3 renews the attack. The knight is hit twice, defended once, and white is winning comfortably, so knight to a5 scuttles to the edge. Remember that square, now what would you play here? Kramnik chooses rook to e8, check, offering the rook to its counterpart on d8. Black can step the king to g7 or h7, or simply take. It keeps things winning, but there was better. So why give up the tension at all? Queen to b5 was the move. She comes to the queen's side where the black knight and bishop are stranded and helpless, and that rook check stays in the pocket for later. Black grabs the pawn with bishop takes b3, and only then does rook to e8, check, arrive. Rook takes e8 answers it, and white is winning far more clearly than in the game. That is not what happened. The check came first. Rook takes e8 accepts the trade, and queen takes d5 collects the bishop. Now look carefully at the pawn on f7. It stands between that queen and the king on g8, so it is frozen to the spot. That is the first of two pins that decide this game. Aronian tries rook to d8, planting the rook in front of the queen and asking her to move again, all while she is also keeping an eye on the stranded knight over on a5. Queen to b5 does both, hitting the bishop on b6 and the knight on a5. Rook to d6 comes across to defend along the 6th. King to c2 is a very human move. Kramnik tidies his own king before pressing on, though queen to e5 was the sharper try. Nothing is spoiled. Those queenside pieces are still going nowhere. Let's stop here and look at what black actually owns. The bishop on b6 and the knight on a5 are both under fire from that queen, both huddled on the rim, defending each other and nothing else. The king sits behind pawns already pushed to g5 and h6. So if you were Aronian, how would you untangle this? Pause here and try to find it. There is one move that keeps the game breathing, and it asks the bishop to give up its post. Instead came king to g7, a sensible-looking move that does nothing at all about the problem. The bishop and knight stay glued together on the edge, and now white's grip becomes decisive. So what was the saving idea? Bishop to d8. The bishop drops back and guards the knight from a square the queen cannot touch, keeping the two pieces connected and holding white's advantage to something black might survive. But the king's step was played, and now the queenside pawns start rolling. The pawn goes to b4, attacking the knight a second time. Knight to b7 retreats, and the wandering begins in earnest. White continues c4, taking still more ground. Rook to f6 shuffles across to help, then g4 locks the kingside pawns solid, and knight to d8 goes hunting for a square. Now c5 attacks the bishop on b6. Bishop to c7 steps back onto the diagonal towards h2. Queen to d7 is the killer placement. She hits the bishop on c7 and the knight on d8 together, and the pawn on f7 is frozen once again in front of its king. That is the second time this same pawn has been nailed down. Knight to c6 defends the bishop for one move, but b5 attacks the knight immediately. Knight to a7 backs off to the corner, and there it is, the very square it stood on before, a knight that has spent this whole game traveling from one edge to another. The bishop is undefended again. Queen takes c7 duly pockets the bishop. Knight takes b5 snatches a pawn and attacks the queen. Queen to e5 answers with a fresh pin. The rook on f6 now stands between her and the king on g7, and it cannot leave that square. Effective, though not the most precise idea available. So what was cleaner? Queen to d7. She holds the pin on f7 and goes hunting the loose knight instead of settling for the rook. Black would try rook to a6, propping the knight up sideways, but queen takes b5 takes it anyway, and even with rook to a2, check, thrown in, White is winning with a whole piece extra. In the game, though, the queen went to e5. Knight to a7, that's square for the third time, and the rook still cannot move. King to d3 strolls calmly towards the center, and Aronian had seen enough. Black resigned here, and you can see the reason. The rook on f6 is nailed to its king by the queen on e5. The knight is back on a7 for the third time in the game, and white's pawns and king can walk wherever they please. 2 pins on that king side, one on the f7 pawn and one on the f6 rook, and neither pinned piece ever moved a single square. The idea to take with you: pieces that only defend each other on the edge of the board are not defended at all. They are trapped together. Thanks for watching Nocturne Chess. If you enjoyed this game, subscribe for more quiet journeys through chess history. Until the next board, good night.